Yes, I shaved. It was time. On Wednesday, April 3rd, in the morning, I found Johnson very busy putting his books in order. And as they were generally very old ones, clouds of dust were flying around him. He had on a pair of large gloves such as hedgers use. His present appearance put me in mind of my uncle, Dr. Boswell's description of him. A robust genius born to grapple with whole libraries. I gave him an account of a conversation which had passed between me and Captain Cook the day before at dinner at Sir John Pringle's, and he was much pleased with the conscientious accuracy of that celebrated circumnavigator, who set me right as to many of the exaggerated accounts given by Dr. Hawkesworth on his voyages. I told him that while I was with the captain I catched the enthusiasm of curiosity and adventure, and felt a strong inclination to go with him on his next voyage. Johnson said, "Why, sir, a man does feel so till he considers how very little he can learn from such voyages." I said, "But one is carried away with the general grand and instinct notion of a voyage around the world." Johnson said, "Yes, sir, but a man is to guard himself against taking a thing in general." I said I was certain that a great part of what we are told by the travelers to the South Sea must be conjecture, because they had not enough of the language of those countries to understand so much as they have related. Objects falling under the observation of the senses might be clearly known, but everything intellectual, everything abstract, politics, morals, and religion, must be darkly guessed. Dr. Johnson was of the same opinion. He, upon another occasion, with a friend, mentioned to him several extraordinary facts as communicated to him by the circumnavigators, slyly observed, "Sir, I never before knew how much I was respected by these gentlemen. They told me none of these things." And that friend, according to a footnote that he was talking to, was James Hutton, the Moravian. Johnson had been in company with Omai, Omai, a native of one of the South Sea Islands, after he had been some time in the country. He was struck with the elegance of his behavior, and accounted for it thus. Sir, he had passed his time while in England only in the best company, so that all that he had acquired of our manners was genteel. As proof of this, Sir Lord Mulgrave and he dined one day at Streatham. They sat with their backs to the light, fronting me, so that I could not see distinctly, and there was so little of the savage in Omai that I was afraid to speak to either, lest I should mistake one for the other. We agreed to dine today at the Mitre Tavern, my favorite place, after the rising of the House of Lords, where a branch of the litigation concerning the Douglas estate, in which I was one of the counsel, was to come on. I brought with me Mr. Murray, Solicitor General of Scotland, now one of the judges of the Court of Session, with the title of Lord Henderland. I mentioned Mr. Solicitor's relation, Lord Charles Hay, with whom I knew Dr. Johnson had been acquainted. Johnson said, "I wrote something for Lord Charles, and I thought he had nothing to fear from a court-martial. I suffered a great loss when he died. He was a mighty pleasing man in conversation, and a reading man. The character of a soldier is high. They who stand forth the foremost in danger for the community have the respect of mankind. An officer is much more respected than any other man who has as little money. In a commercial country, money will always purchase respect, but you find an officer who has, properly speaking, no money, is everywhere well received and treated with attention. The character of a soldier always stands him in stead." I said, "Yet, sir, I think that common soldiers are worse thought of than other men in the same rank of life, such as laborers." Johnson said, "Why, sir, a common soldier is usually a very gross man, and any quality which procures respect may be overwhelmed by Grossness. A man of learning may be so vicious or so ridiculous that you cannot respect him. A common soldier, too, generally eats more than he can pay for. But when a common soldier is civil in his quarters, his red coat procures him a degree of respect. The peculiar respect paid to the military character in France was mentioned, I said. I should think that there, where military men are so numerous, they would be less valued as not being rare. Johnson answered, Nay, sir, wherever a particular character or profession is high in the estimation of a people, those who are of it will be valued above other men. We value an Englishman highly in this country, and yet Englishmen are not rare at all. Mr. Murray praised the ancient philosophers for the candor and good humor with which those of different sects disputed with each other. Oh, I didn't know Mr. Murray was with them. Did they mention that? Nope. Well, Mr. Murray's with them, I guess. Mr. Murray praised the ancient philosophers for the candor and good humor with which those of different sects disputed with each other. Johnson said, Sir, they disputed with good humor because they were not in earnest as to religion. Had the ancients been serious in their beliefs, we should not have had their gods exhibited in the manner we find them represented in the poets. The people would not have suffered it. They disputed with good humor upon their fanciful theories because they were not interested in the truths of them. When a man has nothing to lose, he may in good humor with his opponent. Accordingly, you see in Lucian, the Epicurean, who argues only negatively, keeps his temper. The Stoic, who has something positive to preserve, grows angry. Being angry with one who controverts an opinion which you value is a necessary consequence of the uneasiness which you feel. Every man who attacks my belief diminishes in some degree my confidence in it, and therefore makes me uneasy. And I am angry with him who makes me uneasy. Those only who believe in revelation have been angry at having their faith called in question, because they only had something upon which they could rest as matter of fact. Murray said to this, It seems to me that we are not angry at a man for controverting an opinion which we believe in value. We rather pity him. Johnson said, Why, sir, to be sure, when you wish a man to have that belief which you think is of infinite advantage, you wish well to him. But your primary consideration is your own quiet. If a madman were to come into this room with a stick in his hand, no doubt we should pity the state of his mind. But our primary consideration would be to take care of ourselves. We should knock him down first and pity him afterwards. No, sir, every man will dispute with great good humor upon a subject in which he is not interested. I will dispute very calmly upon the probability of another man's son being hanged. But if a man zealously enforces the probability that my own son will be hanged, I shall certainly not be in the very good humor with him. I added this illustration. If a man endeavors to convince me that my wife, whom I love very much and in whom I place great confidence, is a disagreeable woman and is even unfaithful to me, I shall be very angry, for he is putting me in fear of being unhappy. Murray said, But, sir, truth will always bear an examination. Johnson said, Yes, sir, but it is painful to be forced to defend it. Consider, sir, how should you like, though conscious of your innocence, to be tried before a jury for a capital crime once a week? We talked of education at great schools, the advantages and disadvantages of which Johnson displayed a luminous manner. But his arguments preponderated so much in favor of the benefit which a boy of good parts might receive at one of them that I have reason to believe Mr. Murray was very much influenced by what he had heard today in his determination to send his own son to Westminster School. I have acted in the same manner with regard to my own two sons, having placed the eldest at Eton and the second at Westminster. I cannot say which is best, but in justice to both those noble seminaries, I with high satisfaction declared that my boys have derived from them a great deal of good and no evil. And I truly trust that they will, like Horace, be grateful to their father for giving them so valuable an education. I introduced a topic which is often ignorantly urged, that the universities of England are too rich, so that learning does not flourish in them as it would do if those who teach had smaller salaries and it depended on the assiduity for a great part of their income. Footnote here about universities being too rich. Dr. Adam Smith, who was for some time a professor at the University of Glasgow, has uttered in his Wealth of Nations some reflections upon this subject which are certainly not well founded and seem to be invidious. Johnson said of this topic, "Sir, the very reverence of this is the truth. The very reverse of this is the truth. The English universities are not rich enough. Our fellowships are only sufficient to support a man during his studies to fit him for the world, and accordingly, in general, they are held no longer than till an opportunity offers of getting away. Now and then, perhaps, there is a fellow who grows old in his college, but this is against his will, unless he be a man very indolent indeed. 100 a year is reckoned a good fellowship, and that is no more than is necessary to keep a man decently as a scholar. We do not allow our fellows to marry because we consider academical institutions as preparatory to a settlement in the world. It is only by being employed as a tutor that a fellow can obtain anything more than a livelihood. To be sure, a man who has enough without teaching will probably not teach, for we would all be idle if we could. In the same manner, a man who is to get nothing by teaching will not exert himself. Gresham College was intended as a place of instruction for London. Able professors were to read lecture gratis. They contrived to have no scholars, whereas if they had been allowed to receive but sixpence a lecture from each scholar, they would have been emulous to have had many scholars. Everybody will agree that it should be the interest of those who teach to have scholars, and this is the case in our universities. That they are too rich is certainly not true, for they have nothing good enough to keep a man of eminent learning with them for his life. In the foreign universities, a professorship is a high thing. It is as much almost as a man can make by his learning, and therefore we find the most learned men abroad are in the universities. It is not so with us. Our universities are impoverished of learning by the penury of their provisions. I wish there were many places of 1,000 a year at Oxford, to keep first-rate men of learning from quitting the university. Undoubtedly, if this were the case, literature would have a still greater dignity and splendor at Oxford, and there would be grander living sources of instruction. I mentioned Mr. Maclaurin's uneasiness on account of a degree of ridicule carelessly thrown on his deceased father in Goldsmith's History of Animated Nature, in which that celebrated mathematician is represented as being a subject to fits of yawning so violent as to render him incapable of proceeding in his lecture. A story altogether unfounded, but for the publication of which the law should give no reparation. A footnote here. Dr. Goldsmith was dead before Mr. Maclaurin discovered the ludicrous error, but Mr. Norris, the bookseller who was the proprietor of the work, upon being applied to by Sir John Pringle, agreed very handsomely to have the leaf on which it was contained cancelled and reprinted without it at his own expense. Whenever I see that name John Pringle, I just want potato chips. Anyway, where was I? This led us to agitate the question whether legal redress could be obtained even when a man's deceased relation was calumniated in a publication. Mr. Murray maintained there should be reparation, unless the author could justly justify himself by proving the fact. Johnson said, "Sir, it is of so much more consequence that truth should be told than that individuals should not be made uneasy, that it is much better that the law does not restrain writing freely concerning the characters of the dead. Damages will be given to a man who is calumniated in his lifetime because he may be hurt in his worldly interests, or at least hurt in his mind. But the law does not regard that uneasiness which a man feels on having his ancestor calumniated. That is too nice. Let him deny what is said, and let the matter have a fair chance by discussion. But if a man could say nothing against a character but what he can prove, history could not be written, for a great deal is known of men of which proof cannot be brought. A minister may be notoriously known to have bribes, and yet you may not be able to prove it." Mr. Murray suggested that the author should be obliged to show some sort of evidence, though he would not require a strict legal proof. But Johnson firmly and resolutely opposed any restraining whatsoever, as averse to a free investigation of the characters of mankind. And I think now we have the award for the longest footnote in this book. I'll show it to you. Get ready. Probably finish me off for the day. So that's where I just read, and this is all footnote, the whole rest of the page. And that's not it. It also goes on to this page. So this entire page would be a footnote, but they had to put a little something up there, or else it would look weird. And so they continued on to this page. So I wonder what's so important that we had to put into a footnote, huh? Boswell wants to clarify something. What a surprise. What Dr. Johnson has here said is undoubtedly good sense, yet I am afraid that law, though defined by Lord Coke the perfection of reason, is not altogether with him. For it is held in the books that an attack on the reputation even of a dead man may be punished as a libel because tending to a breach of the peace. There is, however, I believe, no modern decided case to that effect. In the King's Bench, Trinity Term, 1790, the question occurred on occasion of an indictment, the King versus Topham, who, as a proprietor of a newspaper entitled The World, was found guilty of a libel against Earl Cowper, deceased, because of certain injurious charges against his lordship were published in that paper. An arrest of judgment having been moved for, the case was afterwards solemnly argued. My friend Mr. Const, whom I delight in having an opportunity to praise, not only for his abilities but his manners, a gentleman whose ancient German blood has been mellowed in England, and who may be truly said to unite the baron and the barrister, was one of the counsel for Mr. Topham. He displayed much learning and ingenuity upon the general question, which, however, was not decided, as the court granted an arrest chiefly on the informality of the indictment. No man has a higher reverence for the law of England than I have, but with all deference I cannot help thinking that prosecution by indictment, if a defendant is never to be allowed to justify, must often be very oppressive, unless juries, whom I am more and more confirmed in holding to be judges of law as well as of fact, resolutely interpose. Of late an Act of Parliament has passed declaratory of their full right to one as well as the other, in matter of libel, and a bill having been brought in by a popular gentleman, Fox, may of his party have in most extravagant terms exclaimed on the wonderful acquisition to the liberty of the press. For my own part, I ever was clearly of opinion that this right was inherent in the very constitution of a jury, and indeed in sense and reason inseparable from their important function. To establish it, therefore, by statute is, I think, narrowing its foundation, which is the broad and deep basis of common law. Would it not rather weaken the right of primogeniture, or any other old and universally acknowledged right, should the legislator pass an act in favour of it. In my letter to the people of Scotland against diminishing the number of the Lords of Session, published in 1785, there is the following passage, which, as a concise and I hope a fair and rational state of the matter, I presume to quote. The juries of England are judges of law as well as of fact in many civil and in all criminal trials. That my principles of resistance may not be misreprehended any more than my principles of submission, I protest that I should be the last man in the world to encourage juries to contradict rashly, wantonly, or perversely the opinion of the judges. On the contrary, I would have them listen respectfully to the advice they receive from the bench, by which they may be often well directed in forming their own opinion, which, and not in others, is the opinion that they are to return upon their oaths. But where, after due attention to all that the judge has said, they are decidedly of a different opinion from him, they have not only a power and a right, but they are bound in conscience to bring in a verdict accordingly. All right, so Boswell just had to get that off his chest. Well, until next time, bye from Boswell.